On a gray morning in March, the residents of Charleston, West Virginia, woke to news that would shake their quiet community to its core. A case that had been sealed in dusty boxes for over 5 decades had finally been solved, but the identity of the person arrested would prove far more disturbing than the mystery itself. The Kanawha County Sheriff's Department had just taken into custody someone the entire town knew, someone who had lived among them for all these years, hiding in plain sight. The announcement sent shockwaves through the valley, forcing neighbors to question everything they thought they knew about the people around them. But to understand how this moment arrived, we must travel back to a cold November evening in 1971. The year was winding down when 23-year-old Diane Hartwell disappeared. She had been a familiar face in Charleston, working at the public library on Capitol Street and living in a modest apartment near the university. Diane was known for her warm smile and her habit of walking home after her evening shifts, even when the autumn air turned bitter. She loved the quiet streets at night, she had told friends, the way the old street lamps cast pools of amber light on the sidewalks, the sound of the Elk River rushing in the distance. Those who knew Diane well described her as someone with an infectious enthusiasm for life. She had graduated from West Virginia University 2 years earlier with a degree in English literature, harboring dreams of one day becoming a novelist. Her apartment was filled with notebooks containing half-finished stories and poetry, windows into a creative mind that never stopped working. On weekends, she would sit at a corner table in the local diner, drinking coffee and writing for hours, occasionally looking up to observe the people around her, gathering material for the characters that populated her imagination. Her co-workers at the library adored her. She had a gift for recommending exactly the right book to each patron, somehow intuiting what they needed even when they could not articulate it themselves. Children especially loved her. Gathering around during the Saturday morning story hours she led, captivated by the different voices she created for each character, the way she made stories come alive. Parents would linger at the back of the room, charmed by her natural ability to connect with young minds. Diane had moved to Charleston from a small mining town in the southern part of the state, seeking independence and opportunity. Her father had passed away when she was 16, a mining accident that had devastated the family. Her mother had remarried a year later and moved to Ohio, but Diane had chosen to stay in West Virginia, the mountains and valleys feeling like home in a way nowhere else could. Her brother Thomas had been her anchor, the one constant family connection in her new life in Charleston. Friends described her as cautiously optimistic, someone who had experienced loss but refused to let it dim her belief in the goodness of people. She dated occasionally but had no serious relationship at the time of her disappearance. She was, by all accounts, focused on building her career and nurturing her writing, content with the quiet rhythm of her life in Charleston. On November 18th, Diane finished her shift at 9 in the evening. The head librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, watched her pull on her navy blue coat and wrap a cream-colored scarf around her neck. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the streets with a thin white veil. Diane waved goodbye, pushing through the heavy wooden doors into the night. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. When Diane failed to show up for work the next day, her colleagues initially assumed she had caught a cold. The weather had turned particularly harsh overnight, with temperatures plummeting and the snow intensifying. But when her supervisor tried calling her apartment and received no answer, a seed of worry began to grow. By the second day, that worry had blossomed into genuine concern. Her older brother, Thomas, a coal miner who lived on the outskirts of town, reported her missing on November 20th. He had driven to her apartment, finding her door locked and her mail piling up in the slot. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the absence of any sign of his sister filled him with dread. The Charleston Police Department began their investigation immediately, but in those early days they had precious little to work with. The search for Diane Hartwell consumed the city. Volunteers combed through the streets she would have walked, checking alleyways and abandoned buildings. The police interviewed everyone who had been working at the library that night, everyone who lived along her usual route home, anyone who who might have seen something unusual, but the trail was cold from the start, made colder by the snow that had covered any potential evidence that first night. The community response was overwhelming. Hundreds of residents joined search parties, dividing into groups that systematically covered every possible area she might have been. They searched along the riverbanks, through the wooded areas on the outskirts of town, in vacant lots and construction sites. Local businesses printed flyers with Diane's photograph, her gentle smile looking out from every storefront window and telephone pole. Radio stations broadcast descriptions of her, asking anyone with information to come forward. Thomas organized many of these search efforts, barely sleeping, driven by a desperate hope that somehow his sister would be found alive. He walked the route from the library to her apartment dozens of times, trying to imagine what might have happened, where she might have gone or been taken. The not knowing was torture, each day that passed without answers, deepening the gnawing fear in his chest. The library closed for 3 days as staff members dealt with the shock and grief. When it reopened, there was a palpable sadness in the halls where Diane had worked. Patrons would come in asking for updates, sharing their own memories of her kindness. The children's section felt especially empty without her voice bringing stories to life. Detective Caswell conducted his investigation with meticulous care, aware that every hour that passed made finding Diane less likely. He established a timeline of her last known movements, interviewed her neighbors about any unusual activity, checked with local taxi and bus companies to see if anyone matching her description had been seen that night. He reviewed the library's visitor log, noting everyone who had been there that evening, cross-referencing names with any known offenders in the area. Then, on December 3rd, a hunter stumbled upon something terrible in the woods east of the city, near the Cabin Creek area. There, partially covered by fallen leaves and the season's first real snowfall, lay Diane's body. She had been there since the night she disappeared, hidden among the bare trees and frozen earth. The discovery sent a wave of grief through Charleston, transforming hope into mourning. The hunter, a local man named Gerald Morrison who had been tracking deer through the woods, would later describe the moment of discovery as something that haunted his dreams for years afterward. The morning had been crisp and clear, sunlight filtering through the skeletal branches of oak and maple trees. He had been following tracks when something caught his eye, a splash of color that did not belong in the winter landscape. The cream-colored scarf, the same one Mrs. Patterson had watched Diane wrap around her neck that final evening. The police secured the scene immediately, photographers documenting every detail before the evidence collection began. The location was remote, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that branched off from the main highway, a place locals knew, but that rarely saw traffic, especially in winter. Detective Caswell arrived within the hour, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. The position of the body, the surrounding area, everything told a story he wished he did not have to read. The news spread through Charleston like a shockwave. The library closed again, this time for a week, as the staff struggled to process the loss of their colleague. Mrs. Patterson, who had worked with Diane daily, took to her bed for days, unable to accept that the vibrant young woman she had watched leave that November evening would never return. The children who had attended Diane's story hours asked their parents why she was gone, questions that had no satisfying answers. Thomas received the news at the mining site where he worked, pulled aside by his foreman who had heard it on the radio. He collapsed to his knees in the dirt, the weight of confirmation crushing the fragile hope he had been maintaining. His co-workers helped him to his truck, and he drove straight to the police station, demanding to see his sister, to know what had happened. Detective Caswell met with him privately, sharing what little information he could while the investigation was ongoing, his heart breaking for this young man who had just lost his only sibling. The investigation that followed was exhaustive for its time. Detective Raymond Caswell, a veteran of the Charleston Police Department, led the case with a determination that bordered on obsession. He interviewed hundreds of people, followed dozens of leads, and worked 16-hour days trying to piece together what had happened to Diane. The evidence suggested she had been taken against her will shortly after leaving the library, though no witnesses had come forward to report seeing anything unusual that night. Several suspects emerged in those first months. There was a drifter who had been seen in the area around that time, a man with a history of violence who had moved through West Virginia like a ghost. Police tracked him to Ohio, questioned him extensively, but could never connect him definitively to Diane's case. There was also a former boyfriend, someone Diane had dated briefly the previous summer. The relationship had ended badly, with rumors of jealousy and heated arguments. He became a person of interest, enduring weeks of scrutiny before his alibi was finally verified by multiple witnesses. As the months turned into years, the case began to fade from the front pages. Detective Caswell never gave up, maintaining a thick file of notes and evidence, but new cases demanded attention and resources were limited. By the mid-70s, Diane Hartwell's case had become what investigators dreaded most: a cold case, a file gathering dust, a family's questions left unanswered. Thomas Hartwell never stopped searching for answers. Even as he grew older, married, and had children of his own, he carried the weight of his sister's unsolved case. He would visit the police department periodically, asking if there had been any developments, any new leads. The answer was always the same. The years passed, and Charleston changed. The old library where Diane had worked was renovated, then eventually replaced with a modern building. The streets she had walked were repaved. The buildings she had passed were torn down and rebuilt. The city moved forward, but for those who remembered, the question of what happened to Diane Hartwell remained a painful wound that refused to heal. Detective Caswell retired in the late 80s, handing over his cases to a new generation of investigators. Before he left, he made sure Diane's file was carefully preserved, along with all the physical evidence that had been collected. DNA testing was still in its infancy, but he had a feeling that someday science might catch up to the mystery. He passed away in 2003. Never knowing if his intuition would prove correct. In the years before his passing, Caswell had spoken occasionally about the Hartwell case to younger detectives, treating it as a teaching opportunity about the importance of thorough evidence collection and documentation. He would pull out the file during training sessions, showing how he had cataloged every piece of evidence, how he had maintained detailed interview notes, how he had preserved biological samples using the best practices available at the time, even when testing capabilities were limited. His widow, Eleanor, attended a private meeting with Detective Monroe after the arrest was made. She brought with her a box that Raymond had kept in his study, materials he had maintained even in retirement. Inside were newspaper clippings about the case, copies of his notes, and a journal where he had recorded his thoughts and theories over the years. On the inside cover, written in his careful handwriting, was a message that made Monroe's throat tighten. For the detective who finally solves this, the evidence is there, the science will catch up. Never stop looking. Eleanor told Monroe that Raymond had never forgiven himself for not solving the case, while Diane's brother was young enough to find some measure of peace with the answer. He had attended Thomas's wedding, had seen him at community events over the years, and each encounter had been a reminder of the closure he could not provide. The case had haunted him, she said, following him into retirement, appearing in his thoughts during quiet moments, a persistent whisper of unfinished business. The revelation that Preston Waverly had been interviewed during the original investigation and cleared added another layer of weight to the case. Caswell had spoken with him, had recorded his statement, had seen no reason to suspect the mild-mannered maintenance worker who had expressed appropriate shock and concern about Diane's disappearance. The interview notes showed nothing unusual, no red flags that should have triggered deeper scrutiny. This fact tormented Monroe as she reviewed the case file. Even with perfect hindsight, knowing what they now knew, she could not identify any mistake Caswell had made. Waverly's story had been consistent, his demeanor unremarkable, his alibi vague enough to be believable for someone who had simply been working alone in a building after hours. Without physical evidence linking him to the scene, without the DNA technology that would not exist for decades, there had been no reason to focus on him as a suspect rather than just a witness. The case might have remained frozen in time if not for a combination of advancing technology and a dedicated team of modern investigators who refused to let old cases die. In 2018, the Kanawha County Sheriff's Department established a cold case unit, specifically tasked with reviewing unsolved crimes using new forensic techniques. Among the first cases they pulled from the archives was Diane Hartwell's. Detective Sarah Monroe, a sharp-minded investigator who had joined the department 5 years earlier, volunteered to lead the review. She was drawn to cases like this, mysteries that had defeated previous generations of law enforcement. She began by carefully reading through every page of the original investigation, studying Detective Caswell's meticulous notes, reviewing witness statements that were now decades old. What struck her immediately was how thoroughly the original investigation had been conducted, given the limitations of the time. Caswell had been methodical, documenting everything, preserving evidence with a care that suggested he knew future technology might unlock answers he could not find. Among the evidence were several items that had been collected from the scene where Diane's body was found: fibers from her clothing, samples from beneath her fingernails, and, most importantly, biological evidence that had been carefully stored but never tested using modern DNA analysis. Detective Monroe reached out to a state forensic laboratory that specialized in analyzing old evidence. The question was whether 50-year-old samples could still yield usable DNA profiles. The answer, when it came back, was cautiously optimistic. The samples had been well preserved, and while degraded, there was a possibility that modern extraction techniques could recover genetic material. The process took months. The lab worked carefully using advanced methods that could recover DNA from even minimal biological traces. And then, in the summer of 2019, they got a hit. They had recovered a partial DNA profile, not complete enough for a database match, but enough to potentially exclude or confirm a suspect if one could be identified. But this is where the investigation hit a new wall. Without a suspect to test against, the DNA profile was merely a piece of a puzzle with no picture to guide its placement. Detective Monroe needed a new approach, a way to generate leads in a case where all the original suspects were either cleared, deceased, or impossible to locate. She decided to take a step that was becoming increasingly common in cold case investigations: genealogical DNA analysis. By uploading the DNA profile to public genealogy databases, she hoped to identify relatives of the person who had left genetic material at the scene. It was a long shot, a process that had worked in other cases but was still relatively new and uncertain. The genealogical search took over a year, involving a specialist who built family trees from the genetic matches, tracing branches and connections through generations. The work was painstaking, requiring not just scientific knowledge, but historical research, diving into census records, marriage certificates, birth announcements, and obituaries from across West Virginia and neighboring states. The genealogist, a woman named Rebecca Chen, who had built a reputation for solving impossible cases, approached the work with the patience of someone assembling a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. The DNA profile had matched with several distant cousins in the database, people who had submitted their own DNA hoping to discover family connections, never imagining they might help solve a cold case. From these matches, Rebecca began constructing family trees going back generations to find common ancestors. The work required her to become an amateur historian of West Virginia families. She spent hours in county courthouses, photographing old records with her phone, transcribing handwritten marriage licenses from the 1800s. She navigated through archived newspapers, finding birth announcements and obituaries that helped fill in the gaps. Some branches of the family tree led to dead ends, people who had moved away or whose records were incomplete. Other branches proved more fruitful, yielding names and dates that slowly formed a picture. Detective Monroe checked in regularly with Rebecca, each update bringing a mixture of hope and frustration. The process could not be rushed. Each new piece of information had to be verified, each connection confirmed through multiple sources. False leads had to be eliminated, promising branches explored until they either bore fruit or proved barren. It was detective work of a different kind, trading footwork and interviews for genealogical charts and DNA percentages. As the family tree grew, spanning dozens of pages of carefully documented connections, a pattern began to emerge. The genetic matches all pointed to families that had deep roots in the Charleston area, people whose ancestors had settled in the Kanawha Valley in the 19th century, drawn by coal mining and timber work. This geographic clustering was significant, suggesting the person they sought had likely stayed in the region, had been there in 1971, and remained there still. Then, in late 2020, Something extraordinary emerged from the research. The genealogist working on the case identified a family line that matched the DNA profile. The trail led to a family that had lived in the Charleston area for generations. When Detective Monroe saw the name at the end of that genealogical tree, her blood ran cold. The DNA evidence pointed to someone who had never been on the original suspect list, someone who had, in fact, been interviewed as a witness during the initial investigation. It pointed to Preston Waverly, who in 1971 had been a 28-year-old maintenance worker at the very library where Diane Hartwell had worked. Preston Waverly was now 78 years old, still living in Charleston, a well-known figure in the community. Over the decades, he had become something of a local fixture, a volunteer at the community center, a member of the Historical Society, someone who had spent his retirement years being a friendly face at town events and church gatherings. He had a wife of 50 years, 3 children, and 7 grandchildren. He was, by all accounts, a kind and gentle man who had lived an unremarkable, decent life. Detective Monroe felt the weight of what she had uncovered. Before proceeding, she needed to be absolutely certain. She obtained a court order for a direct DNA sample from Waverly, citing the genealogical evidence as probable cause. The legal process was delicate, and Monroe worked closely with prosecutors to ensure everything was done correctly. They could not afford mistakes in a case this old, this sensitive. When officers approached Preston Waverly with the court order, he agreed without resistance. He seemed confused, even cooperative, providing a DNA sample with the bemused air of someone participating in a bureaucratic formality he did not fully understand. The sample was sent to the lab for comparison with the evidence from Diane's case. The wait for results felt interminable. Detective Monroe reviewed the case files again and again, looking for anything she might have missed, any indication that Preston Waverly had been more than just a peripheral witness 50 years ago. In the original interviews, he had told police he had seen Diane leave the library that night, that he had been cleaning in the back of the building. He had expressed shock at her disappearance, had even joined some of the early search parties. Nothing in his behavior had raised suspicion. When the DNA results came back, they were definitive. The genetic material recovered from the crime scene was a match to Preston Waverly. The statistical probability was overwhelming, billions to 1. After 5 decades, they had found the person responsible for Diane Hartwell's ending. The arrest was planned carefully. Despite Waverly's age, prosecutors were determined to bring him to justice. On that gray March morning, officers arrived at his modest home on the east side of Charleston. His wife answered the door, confusion turning to horror as they explained why they were there. Preston Waverly was taken into custody without incident, still seeming almost disconnected from the reality of what was happening. The news exploded through Charleston like nothing in recent memory. People could not believe it. Preston Waverly, the gentle old man who handed out candy at community events, who helped maintain the walking trails in the park, who had been married to the same woman for 5 decades, was being charged with a crime from 1971. The reactions in the community were visceral and divided. Some refused to believe it, certain there must be some mistake, some contamination of evidence. How could someone live an entire life, raise a family, be a good neighbor, all while carrying such a terrible secret? Others were deeply unsettled, realizing they had never truly known him, that the face he showed the world had been a mask, hiding something dark and unforgivable. Margaret Foster, who had been neighbors with the Waverly family for 30 years, stood in her kitchen when she heard the news on the radio, the coffee cup she was holding slipping from her fingers to shatter on the floor. Preston had helped her shovel snow from her driveway every winter, had fixed her fence when it fell during a storm, had brought over tomatoes from his garden each summer. She had trusted him around her grandchildren, had invited him and his wife to holiday dinners. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, impossible to reconcile. At the community center where Preston had volunteered, the director removed his name from the Wall of Honor, a decision that sparked heated debate among other volunteers. Some argued that his decades of service should count for something, that people were more than their worst acts. Others countered that what he had done to Diane Hartwell invalidated any good deeds that came after, that you could not volunteer your way to redemption for such a terrible act, especially one you had hidden and never confessed. The Historical Society, where Preston had been a member for 20 years, held an emergency meeting to discuss how to handle the the situation. He had helped catalog old photographs, had given presentations on Charleston's history, had been instrumental in establishing a local heritage museum. Now those contributions were tainted. Every memory of working alongside him re-examined through a new and disturbing lens. His children faced perhaps the most difficult reckoning. Two of them lived in Charleston with families of their own, while the third had moved to North Carolina years earlier. They found themselves thrust into an impossible position, defending a father they loved while confronting evidence they could not deny. Neighbors who had known them their entire lives did not know how to act around them, whether to offer sympathy or maintain distance. Their children faced questions at school, the cruelty of association punishing the innocent alongside the guilty. Local pastors found themselves counseling congregants struggling with profound questions about the nature of evil and forgiveness. Could someone who had done something so terrible ever truly repent? If Preston had lived as a seemingly good person for 50 years, did that count for anything? Or was it all performance, guilt management, the maintenance of a necessary fiction? These were not abstract theological questions, but immediate moral dilemmas that affected how people viewed their own lives and choices. For Thomas Hartwell, now 75 years old, the news brought a complicated mixture of emotions. Relief that after all these years there was finally an answer, anger at the decades lost to unknowing, and a profound sadness that could never be fully healed. He had lived most of his life in the shadow of his sister's unsolved case, and now, near the end of his own life, he finally had the truth he had sought for so long. As the case moved toward trial, more details emerged. Prosecutors built their case not just on the DNA evidence, but on a careful reconstruction of that night in November 1971. Preston Waverly had finished his maintenance work after the library closed. He had seen Diane leaving, had offered her a ride given the cold and the snow. She had declined, preferring to walk as was her habit. But Waverly had not accepted her refusal. The evidence suggested he had followed her in his vehicle, had confronted her on a quiet stretch of road. What happened next, the exact sequence of events, could only be inferred from the physical evidence and the location where her body was found. But the DNA told an irrefutable story, placing him at a scene that he had never mentioned to investigators, in a context that contradicted everything he had told police 50 years ago. The question that haunted everyone was why. Why had Preston Waverly, a man with no known history of violence, taken Diane's life that November night? Psychologists consulted on the case suggested that sometimes people are capable of terrible acts in moments that defy their normal behavior, that the human mind contains depth and contradictions that can never be fully understood. Waverly's defense team argued that the DNA evidence, while compelling, did not tell the complete story. They suggested alternative explanations, contamination, the possibility of consensual contact before that night that might explain genetic material. But the prosecution's case was strong, built on modern science, applied to carefully preserved evidence. The trial was scheduled for the following year, but Preston Waverly's health began to decline rapidly. The stress of the arrest, the public scrutiny, the weight of his secret finally exposed seemed to age him overnight. He suffered a stroke 6 months after his arrest, leaving him unable to speak clearly or participate meaningfully in his own defense. The legal proceedings became complicated by questions of competency and fitness to stand trial. His family maintained his innocence, though the DNA evidence was difficult to dispute. His wife of 5 decades stood by him, though friends said she seemed like a ghost of herself, struggling to reconcile the man she had known with the accusations against him. For the community of Charleston, the case became a painful lesson in the limits of how well we can truly know anyone. It raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of guilt and redemption, about whether someone who commits a terrible act can ever truly atone, especially if they spend the rest of their life hiding that act behind a facade of normalcy. The arrest forced Charleston to confront uncomfortable truths about memory, identity, and the performance of normalcy. Psychologists who studied cases like this explained that compartmentalization of this magnitude, while rare, was possible. The human mind has an extraordinary capacity to separate different aspects of experience, to create walls between past and present, between the person we were in a moment of terrible choice and the person we become afterward. But this psychological explanation, however accurate, provided little comfort to those who had known Preston Waverly. They were left to wonder what signs they might have missed, whether there had been moments when the mask slipped, occasions when something darker showed through. Some people began remembering small incidents in a new light. A moment when Preston seemed too interested in news coverage of other crimes, a time when he changed the subject abruptly, when Diane's case was mentioned in conversation years ago. Whether these memories were genuine or reconstructed in hindsight became impossible to determine. The case also highlighted generational trauma and the ripple effects of violence. Diane's nieces and nephews, now middle-aged adults with children of their own, had grown up with the absence of their aunt as a defining aspect of their family identity. Thomas had struggled with trust issues throughout his life, the loss of his sister leaving him cautious and protective in ways that affected his relationships. His own children had inherited that wariness, growing up with a father who checked locks obsessively and worried when anyone was late coming home. The media coverage of the arrest brought renewed attention to other cold cases in West Virginia and across the country. Families who had lost loved ones decades ago contacted Detective Monroe, asking if similar techniques might be applied to their cases. She found herself fielding calls from people whose pain was as fresh as if their loss had occurred yesterday, despite the passage of 30 or 40 or 50 years. Each call was a reminder that unsolved cases do not fade for those left behind, that the not knowing becomes a permanent wound that refuses to heal. Thomas Hartwell passed away before the case could be fully resolved, his health failing after years of waiting for this moment. At his funeral, people spoke of his dedication to finding justice for his sister, of how he had carried that burden with dignity for over 50 years. In a way, the answer he had sought for so long had come too late, arriving only to bring more questions about the nature of evil and the masks people wear. The case also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence and the value of never giving up on unsolved cases. Detective Caswell's careful documentation and evidence preservation from the 1970s had made the modern resolution possible. It was a reminder that justice, however delayed, can still be served when investigators maintain hope and when science advances to meet old mysteries. For the residents of Charleston, the arrest of Preston Waverly served as a sobering reminder that darkness can exist alongside light, that people can compartmentalize their actions in ways that allow them to live dual lives. It challenged the comfortable notion that we can always recognize danger, that evil always announces itself clearly. The story also brought to light the resilience of Diane Hartwell's memory. Though she had been gone for over 50 years, the community came together to honor her life, not just her ending. A memorial was established at the library, not focusing on the tragedy, but celebrating her love of books and her kindness to patrons. People who remembered her shared stories of her warmth, her intelligence, her dreams for the future that had been stolen from her. Detective Sarah Monroe, reflecting on the case, spoke about the responsibility investigators have to the victims and their families. Cold cases are not just files in a basement, she said. They are lives interrupted, families left incomplete, questions that echo through generations. The resolution of Diane's case, she noted, was not just about bringing someone to justice, it was about finally giving a voice to someone who had been silenced, about acknowledging that her life had value and that her story deserved to be completed. As the legal proceedings continued, complicated by Waverly's declining health, the community grappled with what justice could even mean in such circumstances. Some felt that the exposure and arrest were punishment enough for a man in his late 70s. Others insisted that age did not diminish the severity of what had been done, that Diane Hartwell deserved justice regardless of how much time had passed. The case became a touchstone for discussions about cold case investigations across the country, cited as an example of how genealogical DNA could solve cases that had seemed impossible to crack. Other jurisdictions began reviewing their own cold cases, looking for similar opportunities to bring closure to families who had waited decades for answers. In Charleston, the impact rippled through the community in unexpected ways. People began to understand that the past is never truly past, that actions echo through time, that secrets buried for half a century can still surface to demand accountability. It changed how neighbors looked at each other. other, introducing a note of caution, a recognition that everyone carries private histories that may not align with their public personas. For Diane Hartwell's remaining family members, nieces and nephews who had grown up hearing stories of the aunt they never met, the resolution brought a bittersweet sense of completion. They organized memorial service, finally able to say goodbye with the knowledge of what had happened, able to direct their grief and anger toward a specific target rather than the vast uncertainty that had colored their family history for so long. The case taught Charleston and anyone paying attention that time does not erase responsibility, that advances in science can reach back through decades to illuminate truths that once seemed forever obscured. It demonstrated that the dedication of investigators, both past and present, can bridge generations to serve justice. It also served as a reminder of the fragility of the facades people construct. Preston Waverly had built an entire life, created a family, became a valued community member, all while carrying the weight of what he had done to Diane Hartwell. The psychological toll of such compartmentalization is difficult to fathom, the constant vigilance required to maintain that separation between past and present, between the person he had been that November night and the person he presented to the world every day after. As this story reaches its conclusion, the legal case against Preston Waverly remains unresolved, complicated by his health and competency to stand trial. But in a deeper sense, the case has already served its purpose. It has given Diane Hartwell's family the answer they sought for over 50 years. It has demonstrated that justice, however delayed, remains possible, and it has reminded a community that memory and accountability endure. The lesson that emerges from the streets of Charleston, from a case that began in 1971 and found its resolution 50 years later, is both hopeful and sobering. It tells us that truth has a persistent quality, that it will eventually surface no matter how deeply buried. It reminds us that the choices we make echo through time, affecting not just the immediate moment, but decades of consequences. And it challenges us to recognize that the people around us are complex, capable of both great kindness and terrible acts, often existing in the same person. For those who walk the streets of Charleston today, passing the library where Diane once worked, traveling roads she once knew, there is now a completeness to her story that had been missing for so long. Her life, cut short at 23, is no longer defined solely by the mystery of her disappearance, but by the resolution that finally came, by the persistent pursuit of truth that refused to let her story end in uncertainty. The gray March morning when news of the arrest broke has become a dividing line in Charleston's history, a moment when the past and present collided in unexpected ways. It stands as a testament to the power of science, the dedication of investigators, and the enduring human need for answers, for closure, for justice, no matter how long the wait.